Everyone, we are going to reconvene, and I'm very happy to announce our next presenters. Our next presenters are Paige Hardy and Kelsey Shamrell Harrington. Paige and Kelsey, I will let you introduce yourselves and where you work, a little bit about what you do. For attendees, just an FYI that this part of the program will go until 11 o'clock. One other thing I wanted to add before we pivot to our Advising with Authenticity presentation is that I had a great question in the chat from the Policies and Procedures section about whether we provide malpractice insurance to attendees, and I am happy to report that yes, we do. We have malpractice insurance that covers everything that you do as a volunteer with us. So if you're worried about that, fear not, you are covered. And with that, I'm really excited to turn the Zoom mic over to Kelsey and Paige. Paige, are you sharing your PowerPoint?
Okay. I am. Yeah, I will be in a second after we do introductions.
Okay, great. Well, then I will get the heck off of the screen and let you all get started.
Good morning, everybody. I believe Paige is working with setting up the PowerPoint presentation, but I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Kelsey Shamrell Harrington. I work at Entre Hermanos, and I'm an immigration attorney for LGBTQ Latino folks. Paige, do you want to give yourself, and my pronouns are she and her. Paige, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Kelsey. Hi, all. I'm Paige Hardy. I use they, them pronouns. I work with Just Lead Washington, which is an anti-racism kind of diversity, equity, inclusion type organization that works largely with legal aid organizations in Washington State. For access purposes, I'm going to describe what I physically look like for folks, and then I'll invite Kelsey to do the same if Kelsey wants to do so. But I am a mixed race, white presenting femme with short hair. I'm wearing glasses. I have a green bandana around my neck and a blue and white gradient shirt. I'm looking like a camp counselor. I'm really excited about it.
Thanks, Paige. I'm Kelsey Shamrell Harrington. I am a blonde, white presenting person with glasses, and I am wearing a LGBTQ progress flag shirt with a suit jacket over it. I look like I didn't try terribly hard to look like an attorney, but a little hard. Like just, a little.
I love it. I love it. We're here for that. I am going to share my screen, and I'm also going to note I've been having wonky issues with my Wi-Fi, so I'm probably going to go off camera while I go through this when I share the slide deck for us. So I apologize for that in advance. Let's see, can you all see the slides? Awesome. Okay, great. So welcome to our presentation. Just to kind of navigate you through what our process is going to look like is we're going to do a very brief presentation just for some foundational understanding of what we're talking about. And then Kelsey and I are going to do some pre-decided panel questions, which we'll answer based on our lived experiences as attorneys that have volunteered with the legal clinic. And then we'll have some time at the end, I believe, for a Q&A. If you want to ask questions throughout the presentation, that's absolutely fine, and you're welcome to do so. I just ask that Kelsey or Denise read those questions out loud just because I'm unable to access the chat while I'm sharing my screen. So our presentation is centering anti-racism and trans competency as a volunteer. And so this is a lovely slide with our pictures, with our names and our pronouns, which we introduced ourselves. And so this first slide on in front of you is an image that we call the Wheel of Power and Privilege, and it was illustrated by Sylvia Duckworth. And I want to give a quick disclaimer and just acknowledge that the language that's used on this wheel is not perfect. There are some terms that are not the best, most useful, or may not align with how you see yourself. But our goal really with introducing this wheel was to find a framework around identity, power, and privilege that feels less binary. Ultimately, we know as human beings, we cannot collapse ourselves into boxes or circles, and that we're much more nuanced than that. But this is hopefully a useful framing to better understand the ways that our identities shape the way we see and also experience the world, as well as how the world sees us and experiences us. And so if you look at this circle, around the outer edge or the outer ring are the names of different socially constructed identities. So we have gender, formal education, ability, mental health, housing, and language as some examples. And you'll notice at the very center of the wheel is the word power. And this is power that is granted by white dominant society through the systems, structures, and policies and outcomes. And this is sometimes referred to as what people say as privilege. But ultimately, what we're talking about is access to power in a white dominant, white supremacist culture. And as you go from the outer layer of the circle towards the center, you go from the most marginalized in our US society towards the least oppressed, or what we call most privileged. Now, as you are looking across the circle, you might fit into the marginalized categories and you might fit into some privileged categories. And that's totally normal. We have different identities and we're shaped in different ways in how we experience the world. As you'll see, there's some questions next to the circle. And we would love if you kind of chewed on some of these questions as you see where you fit in throughout the circle or this wheel. And for those that are wanting to be a little vulnerable or willing, we invite you to put your answers to some of these questions in the chat. And I'll just invite Kelsey to read off some of those musings, if Kelsey would do so. And the questions are, where are you situated on this wheel? Where do you hold power? And then how do your placements along this wheel impact your experiences working in the legal profession? So I'm going to pause for a little bit just so Kelsey can read any of those answers that might be coming through.
So far, I have not received any, but what I think you'll notice is that very few people are going to be, okay, so I see a big omission from the characteristics on the power and privilege wheel is age and occupation, single moms without support. So this is a limited wheel. It's by way of example, not by way of all of the things that will affect where you are situated. And thank you very much for those comments, because age, occupation, family makeup, those are also very, very big pieces that can affect how we access the world. On there, I see parents of special needs kids being, it says, especially moms of special needs kids who are without resources of a different sort. Denise says, definitely closer to the power center in every category except body size, gender, and sexuality. And I think you'll notice that a lot of these are going to overlap and affect one another. So example, it says, let's see, native-born people may feel more comfortable challenging power norms is another comment we've received.
Yeah, these are beautiful comments.
Yeah, so, but yeah, pretty close to the center, except skin color, sexuality, and housing. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
and some of these are also going to be fluid over time. Someone might be read as one type of presentation in one context and read as a different type of presentation in another context.
Absolutely. I'm gonna thank you for everyone for sharing these comments and thoughts. And yes, uplifting +1 to the person who said that this is an imperfect circle. These are not all the identities. There's definitely no way that we could articulate all the identities that impact who has access to power and who's marginalized in our society, but this is certainly one way to look at it. But we just wanted to get the conversation going about people's access to power and who has it. And so this next slide is an image that's similar to the circle that we just saw, but it has all of the identities overlapping or intersecting. And that's really kind of the goal that we wanted to show this image for, is that we all have overlapping or intersecting identities. And as I mentioned before, we might experience privilege in some categories, we might experience marginalization in others, and some people have multiple marginalized identities or privileged identities. But we really wanted to just bring this slide up to talk about the concept of intersectionality, which Denise mentioned previously at the last presentation. But I just wanted to read this quote from preeminent critical race theory scholar, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, which reads, quote, "Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege," end quote. And I really want us to recognize the intersections, not only that we embody, but that those of our clients. And name that having multiple intersecting identities makes you more likely to experience harm or discrimination based on those identities. And to think through this a little bit more, Kelsey's gonna move us through some polling questions to get a sense of how we experience the world a little bit more. Again, these are not perfect questions, but we just wanted to get a sense of where folks are at.
All right, and I don't actually have access to that poll myself, Paige.
Okay, Denise, is that something you can do for us?
Yeah, I got it.
Thank you.
Okay, so there should be a poll showing up on your screen. Some of the poll questions are, have you ever lived outside of Washington State? Have you ever had a K through 12 or equivalent teacher that identified as the same race or ethnicity as you? Have you ever had a university or law school professor that identified as the same race or ethnicity as you? Again, this training being directed towards attorneys primarily. Number 4, have you ever had a supervisor that identified as LGBTQ+? Have you ever had to ask for an accommodation at work? And then a couple specific to our Q Law clinic. Have you ever worked with a Q Law client that was a different race or ethnicity from you? And have you ever worked with a Q Law client where money or financial concerns were a factor of their legal issue? So I think let's just wait until we get a few answers to that poll. And Paige, maybe you can see, or Denise, the responses to that poll.
Yeah, we're at about 31 responses, so that's we're up to about 60% participation. So I think maybe let's give it another couple minutes because folks are I'm still seeing pretty steady responses coming in.
And these are just a very few questions. You know, you could come up with a list of easily a couple thousand questions to really locate yourself and figure out, you know, what are some experiences and assumptions that you might have based on your experience in life, and where might those be similar to some of your clients or different?
So our responses have slowed down, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So you all should be able to see it now.
Great, thanks. Kelsey, do you mind reading off the results?
Absolutely. So 87% of those who took this poll have lived outside of Washington State. That doesn't always correlate necessarily with a specific area of privilege, but it does mean that we've gained a little bit of a wider perspective and may have had more access to travel. And they don't all have to mean anything either. 23% of us have not had a K through 12 teacher that identified as the same race or ethnicity as us. And I think 85% of us had a university or law school professor who identified as the same race or ethnicity as us. 44% of us have had a supervisor who identified as LGBTQ plus. I'm wondering if a little bit of that is some self-selection. We like to be in safe spaces for ourselves. That's one of those self-protective mechanisms. 44% of us have had to ask for an accommodation at work, and 56% of us have not. 46% of us have worked with a Q Law client who was a different race or ethnicity from ourselves. I wonder if some of the people have not yet worked with a Q Law client as well. And 51% of us have worked with a Q Law client where money or financial concerns were a factor of the legal issue.
Thanks, Kelsey. I really appreciate you reading through those. Before we move on to the next slide, I just want to do a brief content warning that there is some language on the next slide that names violence and harm against people of color. And so if that feels uncomfortable for you, I just want to create space for you to kind of mute me if needed as I talk through, or to look away from your screen or minimize the screen if you need to. I just wanted to put that content warning out there. And so I'm about to move to the next slide now, if I can. There you go. Okay, so this is an iceberg image that's really meant to illustrate the ways that white supremacy, racism, and white dominant culture operate in both obvious and less obvious ways. And so at the tip of the iceberg are examples of what can hopefully all agree are some overt examples of racism. So we have groups like the KKK and neo-Nazis that are both actively and explicitly racist and anti-Semitic, but then we also have some harmful actions like racial slurs. And these are the types of examples that I would say most people point to when we're talking about racism. The problem is that this is where some folks want to stop talking about racism. They think that racism stops at overt acts or groups that are explicitly racist. But what I want to challenge us to do is that we have a responsibility to actually go below the waterline or below the surface to see what else is there. And when we actually take a look at below the surface, we have examples of the way that white supremacy really manifests itself in our lives more covertly. And so I'm just going to read a couple, but we have examples such as the denial of having white privilege, believing we're in a post-racial society, assuming that good intentions are enough to not be racist, not challenging racist jokes or comments, or, for example, the ways that our education system in the United States is white-centered and explicitly anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. So not only should we be paying attention to the overt examples of racism and white supremacy that exist, but we should also be identifying and addressing the ways that white supremacy operates more covertly in our society, our profession, the legal system, and in our lives. And it's particularly important, for example, if you look on the slide where it talks about housing discrimination, that these are important things to be thinking about when your client is telling you that they're experiencing discrimination at the workplace, with respect to their housing from their landlord or apartment manager or housing manager, that these are very real experiences. And it's important to really disentangle ourselves from this idea that racism only looks a certain way. That very much centers white folks in that understanding of racism. So this next slide speaks to what we call white dominant culture or white supremacy culture. And it really largely comes from an article by Tema Okun called White Supremacy Culture. And then this framing of the three categories comes from this amazing Turning Towards Each Other, a Conflict workbook, which I highly recommend that everyone, I think it's free, that everyone get. It's so good at like framing up how to be in right relationship with one another and dealing with conflict. But dismantling racism really describes white supremacy culture as the idea that white folks and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, actions, and beliefs, end quote. And it is really reproduced in every single one of our institutions in the United States. And the legal system and the legal profession are not, they are absolutely part of those institutions that are built and based upon white supremacy culture. Tema Okun, the author of White Supremacy Culture article, says, quote, "Culture is so powerful precisely because it is so present and at the same time so difficult to name or identify," end quote. And so to put it another way, white supremacy culture is the water we're swimming in, it's the air we're breathing. And our concept in the legal profession is deeply rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity, as well as white owning class values. And it requires that we adopt, internalize, and assimilate into these values if we want to be seen as successful. And in turn, white supremacy culture really shapes the way that we think, the way that we act, and the way that we make decisions when working with our clients. And it's deeply embedded in how we are interacting with our clients. And so I want to also note that white supremacy culture doesn't just impact white folks, that folks of color can also internalize these characteristics. And Tema Okun also acknowledges this and says that white supremacy culture impacts all of us, but impacts us differently. And so white supremacy culture, for example, targets and violates people of color and communities with the intent to destroy them directly, whereas white supremacy culture targets and violates white folks with a persistent invitation to collude that will ultimately destroy their humanity. And so what's the point of surfacing these characteristics? It's really to challenge our assumptions about what it means to be a successful pro bono volunteer in this work. How are we instead nuancing the conversation and building a culture that truly values collaboration and justice rather than maintaining our sense of power? And how do we instead hold ourselves accountable to disrupting the ways that white supremacy culture really manifests in our relationships with our clients? And then how are we leveraging our positional authority in ways that are more liberatory focused? And so the characteristics in front of you are the characteristics that Tema Okun names in the White Supremacy Culture article. You can find it online. Tema Okun has a brand new website, and then I welcome you to go check that out. But we also created a way to kind of show how you can resist white supremacy culture in your interactions with your clients. And so, and it's a chart, or it's a table with the first column saying, instead of this, and then the next column saying, try this instead. And so the first one, it says paternalism, the assumption that attorneys know better. And instead, what are the lived experiences and skills? How are those equally as valuable as the formal credentials that we hold? And also recognizing the people that are closest to the problems are often closest to the solutions, because they know what's actually workable and what's not going to work based on what their lived experiences are. Another one that comes up is power hoarding. And this is similar to kind of the comic that Denise shared, where it's power dynamics and attorney-client relationships are ignored or go unaddressed. And really the lawyers see themselves as like the heroes or the saviors in this story. And what we want to be doing instead is identifying power dynamics that really are leveraging our relationship to power and putting the power back into community and developing a collaborative process. So I'm not going to read through all of them, but they'll definitely be in our materials after the fact. Kelsey, did you have any suggestions here also about how to resist white supremacy culture in client interactions?
Yeah, so I think that the first one you mentioned, where you recognize that lived experiences of people are going to make them the experts in what solutions will work best. So I think in my practice, one way that I like to make sure that each interaction is centered on the client is by explicitly, calling that out, saying, so you're coming to me here for a legal issue. I have a law degree, but you know 100% more about this situation than I do. So I want this to be a collaboration. You can approach each interaction in a way that invites the person to see you and interact with you, not as an expert in all things, but as an expert in some specific legal issues who can then help problem solve. So I think the most important piece is to just be very mindful of any assumptions you might have.
Thanks,
Because,
Kelsey.
yeah.
Oh, go ahead. No, I think that's really great.
Go ahead.
I'm going to move us to the next. I'm looking at time and I want to make sure we have time to answer questions. So this is a quote from No White Saviors, which is like a great Twitter and Instagram account, which if you're not following, I recommend. And the quote just reads, "The white savior complex convinces you that you are the answer, that you must be a voice for the voiceless. Responsible partnership requires that you pass the mic to the unheard. No one is voiceless. You've been talking over us for far too long." And then the next slide is another quote, which comes from a brilliant law review article called "Rebellious Reflection, Supporting Community Lawyering Practice" by Monica Batra-Kashup. I don't read law review articles. I haven't read a law review article in like years until I read this one, and I can highly recommend it. So if you have the time and energy to read a law review article, this is one of them. And the quote just reads, "Community lawyers envision a collaborative lawyer-client relationship in which lawyers work in solidarity, acting with rather than for clients and communities." And then this one is just, what are some ways to be accountable to clients? We wanted to give you some concrete questions to be thinking through as you're developing the type of relationship you want with clients, also recognizing that each relationship with each client is going to look different. The first question asks us, are we aware of our clients' holistic needs and know how to connect them to community support and power building opportunities? And that goes back to what Denise said at the first part of the training, where what are some of the non-legal remedies that we have for clients and how can we assist them to get there? The next is, are we being transparent with info sharing and decision making? Is the language that you're using accessible to the clients, or are you just making assumptions about whether or not the client understands the language? Are we tracking demographic data of cases we are and are not accepting, and who's less likely or more likely to be served by our services? And then how are we supporting our clients' agency and supporting their self-determination? And then on the last slide, we possibly will get into this a little bit more later in the Q&A portion, or in the panel portion, but I just wanted to kind of go through one of the questions that Denise posed for us to consider is like, what happens when you mess up and you make a mistake? And how does that relate to kind of client building relationships? And so just to frame this up a little bit, I would say that even when you're intentionally building a client relationship, and doing so with the best of intentions, we're all still human and we're bound to mess up. White supremacy culture really makes it that we can't make mistakes and certainly fails us to equip us with the tools to be accountable to one another for the mistakes that we made. And so we wanted to offer up this framing about 4 parts to accountability from Mia Mingus, who's a disability justice advocate and activist, and answer the question, what happens if you're the person that messes up and makes a mistake? The first thing that Mia Mingus suggests is to do some self-reflection. Really think about what went wrong and acknowledge to the person the harm that you caused. Part of this, though, comes with refraining from being defensive, which is, I think, one of the hardest things that we can do. I think our instinct inevitably when we make a mistake is to really kind of protect ourselves from being accused from accusations. But ultimately, a mistake was made and harm was caused by you. You should not be centering yourself in this accountability process. For example, one way that this shows up is that we have this urgency to explain our intent, to be like, hey, that wasn't my intent. I didn't mean bad by it. But the reason that although the intent gives some context about what was happening, the issue is that you had caused harm anyways, and the impact to the person that was harmed is what we're trying to center and repair. And so again, not to center yourself in this process. The next part of accountability is apologizing by acknowledging the mistake that you made. Be thorough about the ways that you messed up and take an honest accounting of the harm that you caused. The next step is repair, and that includes listening to the needs of the person harmed. Sometimes they aren't going to want to engage with you in the repair process, and that is okay, because part of the repair process must be centered on the person that was harmed. And then repair work ultimately looks different for every person, and it's also dependent on the situation. So I thought of like a community example, if like there was community harm done. And if the mistake you make is to the community, repair work to the community can look like reparations. It can look like giving land back to Indigenous communities. It can look like giving up individual power by stepping down or allowing for new leadership. It can include the abolition of cops in prisons. And finally, a genuine apology also includes changed behavior. The best apology is ultimately one where you're not making the same mistake over and over again. Kelsey, did you want to add anything to this section, or did you want to wait until we do the kind of question more later?
The one thing I would add is that part of centering the person who was harmed is responding to their needs. So one common mistake that someone might make is to misgender someone. The harm there is very real, but it's sometimes tempting to kind of center oneself. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. How could I, a real justice advocate, have made such a grave mistake? And the person is just like, can we move on? So, it's important when you're centering the other person to really use your eyes and ears, use your senses, and follow their lead. So supposing that some mistake has been made, follow the lead of the person who has been harmed and what is the appropriate next step.
Thanks, Kelsey. I'm going to turn my video back on since I'm not screen sharing anymore. Denise, were you thinking about asking us the questions, or?
I was not, but I can.
Okay.
Let me find them real fast.
If not, I can post them too. I can post them to Kelsey and we can just do back and forth. So the first question we had was, what should you bring with you into a client interview with a person who you know is different from you?
So I wrote this as a bit of a trick question. If you haven't heard of it, I highly recommend a book, Client-Centered Lawyering. And one of the things that is a takeaway from that is not making assumptions about how different the person that you're speaking with might be from you. You want to come into an interaction with mindfulness about your own location and what you know or suspect about the other person's location in terms of their relationships to power and their identities. But you also want to refrain from making assumptions either that they are similar to you because of shared identities or that they are different from you because of differing identities. You may find areas of common thinking or diverging thinking based on factors such as race or gender, but you also might find areas of commonality or difference based on things like how your birth order affects your worldview, we don't typically think of that as a privilege area, but you might find that you actually have more in common with a client who may be different from you visually or in some of those broader categories in how you think, and you might find that someone who on the surface appears to be similar to you in terms of their demographics might really see and experience the world in a different way. So I think what you should bring with you is self-knowledge and a real sense of humility and openness. Humility in the sense of, my worldview isn't the only worldview. Things I know or assume to be true might not be true for the person I'm talking to. And just a good heart for listening. Also legal knowledge, that's a good one.
Can't forget about that. I think the way that I would answer this question is I would also +1 the bringing the humility into the work that you're doing. I think I would add to kind of what you beautifully shared is that, for example, if you're going to be asking a client a bunch of invasive questions, explain to your client why you need that information and recognize that it can be really challenging and hard to answer those questions, especially if it's related to trauma. Or even things that you might not think are related to trauma could still have a traumatic impact on the individual. So just explaining when you're asking a question, why you're asking it. Another one for humility, I would say, is when a client takes the time to share their story with you, thank them for trusting you with that information and for sharing that with you. And I guess, in addition to bringing your legal knowledge, I would ask that you do a little bit another kind of homework, which is if the client has been to the clinic more than once and legal clinic notes are available, read them so that the client doesn't have to rehash their story over and over and over again. One of the disempowering things is when someone feels like they have to constantly tell their story, because it's likely not only are they telling that story to you, they're having to tell that story to other service providers, to friends and family in order to get assistance. And so if you can minimize the number of times that people have to share their story over and over again, it's a benefit to your client. And then I think I would say that one way that I've seen like white supremacy show up a lot in our legal clinics is maybe not specific to QLA legal clinic because y'all are great, but in other legal clinics that I've volunteered for is the expectation that clients show up in ways that are comfortable for you as the volunteer. So for example, if a client is unable to consistently show up on time, or if they miss appointments and are unable to tell you that they're about to miss an appointment, or present in a way that you might label as incoherent or unintelligible, and really want you to challenge that narrative that you're telling yourself that this client is problematic or is not looking for help or is somehow devaluing your time. I hear that over and over again. If a client doesn't show up, an attorney is like, well, they don't value my time, so I don't care about this person anymore. And understand that there's other circumstances that are bringing someone to be unable to show up or miss an appointment. And the expectation that clients show up or conform to our ideas of professionalism really denies the client their humanity, because we're no longer letting this person show up in the ways that that they're able to show up. So how can we provide accommodations to make your services more accessible? And that's something that Denise and the QLaw crew are incredibly good at, is balancing the ways that you can balance the client's needs as well as your time and energy.
Thank you so much, Paige. I have another question from our Q&A. Always center the client. What does that mean? What does it mean to center the client?
Yeah, I think that's great and always a hard question. I think for me, it's about making the attorney-client interaction less about myself and more about creating a safer space for my client to be able to share and identify what's going on for them. And instead of going into immediate attorney problem-solving mode, how can we co-create a space where the client is able to share their story and I'm able to hear and listen with empathy. So part of that is the client gets to guide what is safe for them or safer for them, because we can't always guarantee complete safety. So how do we make space safer for the client? And as a volunteer, whether you're an attorney, whether you're not an attorney, you have a responsibility to honor, respect, and maintain the boundaries that the client has shared with you. Again, we keep harping on this issue, but valuing your client's experiences. And don't assume also that all alternatives that you think of are actually available to the client. So for example, I met with a client who had a GV related issue, but she was explicitly unwilling to work in the legal system or to cooperate with cops. That was very important to this client. And so recognizing that and holding space for the trauma that this client has experienced, while also being like, these are systems and institutions that you're not wanting to work with. How do we honor that and come up with solutions that are viable, that keep your safety in the forefront, but also allows you to navigate the services that you need that don't replicate harm in the ways that you are trying to avoid. So I think that was I think that's kind of what I mean by centering clients. What about you, Kelsey?
I really want to recognize what Paige said. I think they really covered it beautifully. The one thing that I would add is really letting the client lead the interaction itself. By that, I mean, it can often be helpful to explicitly ask the client, hey, we've got about 30 minutes, we've got about an hour. What do you want to make sure happens? This is a great interviewing skill, even if you're, even if you're in corporate law, honestly. But just really letting the client tell you so that you have a better chance of meeting their needs. A good example of this from a Q Law client interaction that I had was when I identified the person's legal issue that had been, I basically confirmed what they had told our volunteer, oh, you're looking for help with this. And, what can I be most helpful with? It turned out the person had already identified most of the steps they needed to take. And the questions that they most wanted answered were, what is this going to actually look like? What building am I going to? How many people will I have to talk to? And so I was able to be helpful to that person in a better way by responding to the question they actually had, rather than saying, oh, this is a question related to X topic. Here are the things that a person is most likely to need in this situation. I was able to actually tailor it better to that client. For me, that's a big part of what it means to be client-centered.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question, I know, Kelsey, you're excited to answer, but it's, so when will I be culturally competent? Am I going to be competent after this training?
So I would actually like to echo something that a person who was going to be on this panel, Nico Quintana, had said, which was, if this is the person's only experience with cultural competency, I don't think they should really be seeing our clients. And I also want to recognize how awesome many of our audience members are, in that this is probably not the first cultural competency style training that you've received. The obvious yes or no answer to that question is no, you will not be culturally competent after doing this training. It's a process. It's about doing, quote unquote, the work. And the work is going to look differently depending on where you're located. You may be one of those people who has gone to quite a few different trainings, but if you can take this time to think, okay, all of what's been said today, is there any part of it that challenged my assumptions or my normal way of doing things? And then really reflect on that and think about, how can I use this? We all want to become more effective lawyers, and especially more effective lawyers for this community. So really use it as an opportunity. And the other thing is to use this as a jumping off point. If any of those tools that we shared were new to you, or didn't make sense to you, or seemed imperfect to you, they're great opportunities to do some research, or even just, a little self-reflection exercise. What on this seemed off to me? And then, take a look at that answer and why did it seem off? Well, it seemed off because they didn't mention age. That's a pretty big, thing to consider. It didn't mention family status. A 2-parent, 2-child household is not the same as a 1-parent, 3-child household, is not the same as a single person, living in a relationship with several other adults. It's all of these are deeply core to our identities, and they all really affect how we see the world, how we hear the world, how we experience the world, and how we walk into potential legal clinics, both as the attorney and as the client.
Thanks, Kelsey. I think the only thing that I will add or like nuance out from like what I heard you saying is, really kind of underlining that this is a lifelong practice, and it's not just learning how to show up, it's also unlearning the ways that we have been indoctrinated in white supremacy culture in the United States. And doing equity and inclusion and kind of anti-racism work in my professional life, I hear from so many people, especially from white folks, like, just give me a roadmap. Like, what do I need to do so that I can call myself an ally? And I'll do that. Just tell me what I need to do. And unfortunately, in this thing called life, there are no gold stars, there are no certificates, and there's certainly no trophies that you can achieve that will reach you to that point, because it is a lifelong learning process. I was trying to think of an analogy, and the best that I could come up with in like the legal sphere is, let's say you take a family law CLE and you've never practiced family law in your life. A single family law CLE is not going to make you into a family law attorney. Becoming a family law attorney means you have to invest a lot of time and energy and take cases and really build your understanding and analysis around family law cases. And even then, your learning is not complete, because as processes, rules, and statutes change, you also have to adapt the way that you are practicing law. It's certainly not a perfect analogy, but it was the first one that came into mind that helped to underline, I think, the points that Kelsey and I are trying to make.
I love that analogy, specifically because of the ways in which laws are constantly changing, and who each person is as a human being is constantly changing. We're not static beings. So how does this apply specifically to POC, BIPOC, and trans people? And how do we center the lived experiences of our QT, BIPOC, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color clients when working with them through the Q Law Legal Clinic?
That's a huge question, but I'm glad we're going to start teasing out some of it. And I just want to preface that we are not are not going to be able to address this question completely. We're going to certainly start teasing some of it out. I think the first thing that I'm going to say about this is Google is your friend. And I don't mean that to be dismissive. I just mean do your homework. The first step in learning about other communities and cultures that are not your own is by doing research. The caveat to that is when you're doing Google searches, do not rely on TERF or SWERF materials. And TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminism, and SWERF stands for Sex Worker Exclusionary Radical Feminism. There are also some really brilliant people online that are constantly sharing a wealth of knowledge and information. The caveat to that is that if you're a white person, pay up. Make sure you're compensating folks for their lived experiences and sharing their analysis. In case it's helpful, Just Lead Washington, the organization that I work for, we have a cultural competency race equity curriculum that we're happy to share out after this training is over. I think another point to make is don't make assumptions about people. You don't truly know them. And that includes going for names and pronouns, as kind of Kelsey went into a little bit. I think a lot of mistakes are often made when we make assumptions about people, because that's when our biases really manifest in the ways that we show up with one another. So one way to kind of avoid making assumptions in the introduction is introduce yourself, your name, and the pronouns you use. And then ask your client what they would like to be called, what pronouns they use or are comfortable with you using. And they might not use pronouns at all. And the other thing is practice. Practice using pronouns that you're unfamiliar with, including neopronouns. There are a lot of resources online that go through how to pronounce neopronouns, how to conjugate neopronouns, but practice really makes perfect. And then I would say showing up with kind of a non-judgmental attitude. Again, going back to not allowing your implicit and explicit biases show up in the ways that you're interacting with your clients. I have a client example that I can share, but I want Kelsey to go first to share some of her insights.
I'd like to let you go ahead with your example. The only thing that I wanted to add is to be mindful of how you're framing your questions. And it's almost always a good practice to think, would I be comfortable asking this question of someone who was not different from me in this way? So this is specifically if you're speaking with someone who has some significant difference from you. So if you are a white identified person and you're speaking with someone who's a person of color, or if you're cisgender and you're speaking with someone who is identified as transgender or is identified as agender, or non-binary or gender non-conforming, just be very mindful of asking questions in a way that seem respectful, not just to who you're speaking with, but that might seem respectful if you were to ask them of your grandmother, a stranger, someone younger than you, someone older than you. Just try to really think broadly. Let's hear the client example page.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to illustrate or demonstrate one way that anti-Blackness is really baked into the ways that we interact with our clients. And so this isn't a client that I experienced through CULA Legal Clinic. It's from a different clinic experience. And it was for a housing, like a landlord-tenant issue. And I think I was working with this client or working with another attorney, meeting with this client. After we got some information from the client, this other attorney and I went to this room to be able to talk about the case and figure out kind of what our plan or strategy was. And the client looks at me and was like, "Did you see her phone?" And I go, "No, why? What does that matter?" And he was like, "Well, her phone is really nice. If she had such a nice phone, she should probably be able to pay her rent." And this client was a young Black woman. And this attorney didn't realize or think, because of the ways that Black women are demonized in our society. I mean, like thinking back to like Ronald Reagan using welfare queen as a way to demonize Black women, even though white women are more likely to seek government benefits, but was using that as coded language, and didn't realize that a cell phone is a lifeline for a lot of people. Cell phones allow us to have communications with our community. They allow us to maintain jobs. They help us to get from point A to point B. And more important than that, it is none of that attorney's business why that client has a nice phone. And so I just wanted to really kind of illustrate one way that this attorney probably didn't necessarily mean anything by it. Was this also classist? Absolutely. But was it ultimately rooted in racism? Also, yes. And how do we make sure that we're not making assumptions about people because it shows up in really harmful ways? Because that interaction with that client could have ended up in them receiving less quality services from the attorney because the attorney was making a bunch of assumptions about the client. I will get off my soapbox.
And just to add to that page, you as a human being can do something that is deeply rooted in racism. We can argue about whether that makes you a racist person. I think that let's use person first language and say a person who has endorsed racism in that incident. But let's not get focused on, oh gosh, what does this mean about me? When you identify that you have done something that is shaped by racism, that is shaped by white supremacy culture, congratulations, you grew up in a world where that exists and you were not oblivious to it. That's what that means. It also means that you have a real opportunity. If you magically avoid any racist or patriarchal negative actions, you really are not getting opportunity to change and make meaningful differences. It's those of us, and I believe this encompasses everyone, especially white people, but everyone. Those of us who have grown up in a society or lived in a society or seen a society that is shaped by white supremacy have a duty and an obligation, but also a real opportunity to make a difference by identifying those moments and learning from them and letting that teach and be a moment we can take pride in. Like, gosh, I had this moment and I was able to grow from it and not remain static. I'll get off my soapbox. I think a lot of people, it's very tempting to shy away from this work when it shows us something we don't like. And I think that the community as a whole, and also every individual, is much better served by seeing it as a real opportunity.
Definitely. So our time is up. We didn't get to Q&A portion. I'm going to put my email in the chat in case folks want to reach out to me and want to chat about anything. No obligation, but in case it's of interest, Kelsey, I invite you, if you feel comfortable sharing your email, to drop it in the chat. Thank you. And thanks, Denise.
One moment, I'm doing that and I'll end my video.
Thanks so much to both of you. This was really, really helpful. Let's see. So our next step for today is we're going to take another quick 3-minute break, quick stretch break before we move into trauma-informed interview skills. So if you have been thinking through this last session, gosh, this seems like a lot of things to remember. Our next session is really we'll really build on this to give you some concrete sort of tools for how to navigate trauma that people may be walking in with, and how to take care of yourself in this sort of deep learning journey that being a lawyer, navigating systems of power with people who are also trying to navigate these systems, there's a lot that comes along with that. So we'll talk in our next session about some of the tools that you can bring to trauma-informed interview skills, and how you can take care of yourself, your own mental health, so that you can show up as your best self in these interactions. So we'll take about 3 minutes. We'll come back at about 11:06. So take a minute to stretch, and then I'll introduce our next panelists. Thanks.